phenomenology, where in the sections, and again, I think it's very good to reread this as much as you can as we go along. Hegel is not only dense, he's very confusing, and sometimes his examples are off in terms of this chapter, in terms of the science of his day, even though he refers to planetary motion, I think once, and he also refers to the inertia, principles of inertia and acceleration in the sections on force and understanding. Anyway, all to say, I think it will take a different kind of form for you once we get to consciousness, and you can think back, right, of what he's really building towards. And then we can, you know, like I said, we can go back and forth, prospective readings from the preface, introduction, and going forward. I want to emphasize again that Hegel is really trying to do philosophy differently. I want to emphasize that time and time again, that the sections in the introduction is also about knowing, sections that begin on 73, what philosophy is, not as an instrument or the medium, you know, etc. How philosophy is really being attempted here at a presuppositionalist ground. So again, you're always working through this labor of the negative to clear the ground of any presuppositions or any kind of, you know, devoutly held knowledge basis that one has. So it's a real relinquishment, if you will. I mean, maybe this is a good word to think of. With Hegel, one needs to, you know, think about this, that you relinquish, right, one's knowledge base, right? Yeah. And I mean, a good maxim is no longer take anything and literally thing for granted, right? So we're going to be going through this, you know, time and time again, the way of doing philosophy. Differently. This is what he's really trying to do from the outside. Okay? We're also going to read Derrida, speaking of doing philosophy differently, The Pit and the Pyramid, which may make some sense to you. It's an attempt at the overall work, but, you know, I think it will make some sense to you from the position of semiotics, as well as, you know, what Hegel is really up to and how the Derridians, you know, use him as a foil and really work on the edge of the Hegelian system. I think I mentioned to you, this is a book that almost put by Gallimard in bankruptcy, Glas, with which he wages the Jean Genet of public assistance against the Sartre of the Hegelian system. So he reads Genet against Saint-Genet. And it's like a double column, so you're reading, like in the Talmud, you know, you have the Sartrean Genet, right? And you have the Genet himself here, you know, reading each other in terms of back and forth movements. And the risk is, with the Hegelian system, can it be exceeded? Does it produce an excess? So it's an interesting wager that they did as a thought experiment. This was 1974-75. Now, Sartre wrote Saint-Genet 1952. So it's a rereading of this, as well as the Hegelian system by Sartre. And Glas was, I think, 74, if I'm not mistaken, or 75. That was the period, right? So he's risking the Genet of the public assistants, who had no knowledge of the objective system, reading him, right? And he's risking that against Sartre's, you know, the Genet is a movement of existential choices. I am the thief. The melodious child in me is broken. These kind of things. I really recommend Sartre study. It's one of the great psychoanalytic studies of a writer ever done. And actor and comedian, because you consider Genet both an actor and a writer. Yeah. So it's very interesting. So anyway, we'll go to that later. I mean, again, doing philosophy differently, risking, the knowledge base that you may know the system, but then you try to risk something against the system to see how close it is. So I'm planning next week to do something on system versus method. Today we should concentrate on the textual work for force and understanding, and any questions you may have about sense certainty and perception, which are all steps, right, towards knowing, etc. Okay? So, so to go back, we're in the third part of this, of this work, which is now the part that is about force and understanding. And we've gone through sense certainty and the meaning of the this and the that's, right, which is very important. And we also talk about here the 0 point of mediation. There's no mediation, immediate knowledge, right, for Hegel, which is no knowledge at all, the immediacy, right? The elimination of the false starts, how can philosophy, again, be considered scientific, right? So we talked about the acts of utterance, intending, right? The heuristic devices of setting the stage for the first level of mediation, which is that of perception. And perception is the outside, looking back, right? At how one constituted through sense certainty the this and thatness of things in the world, right? And then perception has to do more with representation, right? In this way, right? If we're still in the realm of representation, we have the indifferent this, etc. And remember that the temporality throughout these chapters, sense certainty, perception, and force and understanding to a degree, is the here and now, the hic und nunc, right? So the temporality is the hic, nunc, the here and now, always, right? And, And Hegel will use this nunc often, the now, comma, right? This is after a movement of abstraction has been synthesized and we're going to a higher plane, and sometimes it's also an indicator of a new sphere is opening up, a new dialectical sphere. Okay? And that's good to keep in mind as we go, right? Okay? So nothing's between, in sense certainty, between consciousness and its object. There's nothing between me constituting you. No space, right? In a sense, that's the immediacy. The kind of flash of the other, if you will. The intuitive grasp of the other in an immediate sense. So no spacing, right? No distantiation. And you can think of Hegel as trying to get to some distantiation so that he can move to consciousness, self-consciousness, and then ultimately reason as the purpose of history. All right. So okay. So I guess we can try force and understanding. I mean, we'll kind of make it an open-ended, class in that regard. Again, this is under the heading. It's number 3 in the German. I looked it up in the German. In German, it looks like this. I went to my German because Josh had me going on this. So Kraft is force in German. Verstand. And there's some question on how much does this mean understanding. Right? Verstanden is understand, but force and understand, or stand under, or stand towards, right? And then he goes through, and this is in the text, right? or Erscheinung, right? Which is the Erscheinung, which is appearance, right? The conjunction, right? Über, Sinn, yeah, liegt. AG, Welt, right? And the supersensible world, right? Or the oversensible world, right? Instead of stupor, we use Über as super in the translations, but Über also means towards and over, right? So this preposition in German has multiple meanings, right? That we can take into account in terms of the ambiguity. All right, yeah, you want me to move?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay, so remember this word here. This is a crucial term, right, in terms of going through Hegel. The Über Sinn liegt, right? And it's translated in the book as super sensible, but you could translate it towards, right, the sensible, right, as well as over sensible or overcoming the sensible.
Okay.
Okay? If that helps. I hope it helps a little bit, right? The supersensible world. Remember this. Yeah, this is being translated as super by Miller. It could be over, right? Beyond as well. Towards. So think always directionally here in these words, right? Yeah. Okay? So the true object in this chapter of the understanding is the understanding itself. This is the true object of the chapter, is really the Verstanden, the understanding. Because it's through this pivotal point of understanding that we're going to make the move to consciousness and self-consciousness, which is the next chapter. This is the last of the recapitulation, if you will, of the history of philosophy from Hegel. Okay? This world of appearance. Okay? So, I mean, for those of you that read the Critique of Pure Reason, you can certainly compare this to Sensibility and Understanding and Kant. That section in the Critique of Pure Reason, right? Okay? So, perception, where we left off, the representations of two kinds of objects. Number one, the reflective understanding. So we're going to have in perception, reflective understanding. Not understanding, per se, but reflective understanding. And this is one type of understanding that goes on in perception. So when you perceive, according to Hegel, you are not really in the world of the ontology yet, as in to be is to perceive in the famous statement of Bishop Berkeley. You are more in the world of reflective, representation, if you will. Reflective understanding, okay? You're still in the reflective aspect, right? And then the other one, right, would be underlying this, the awareness of the objects, right, and the representation of universals in perception. But at the same time, we have a non-perceptible understanding, right? That it cannot be perceptible. So this is where we're going. Mm-hmm. Something that cannot be perceived, right? Another type of understanding. So remember, he's playing on multiple levels of terminology here, especially the word. When we say I understand, we don't really know what we're saying, according to Hegel. Is it a reflective understanding? Is it something that you've reflected upon? Is it a non-perceptual understanding? Is it an understanding that's tied to force, the unity of expression in force, etc.? So I want you to kind of ground, understand this, right? I mean, yeah, okay. You've got to grasp it in terms of, what he's doing here as he makes this move, because this is very, very important for him. How do we come to know? Not through sense certainty and the this and the that, in the immediate sense, in the temporal here and now, or the pointing out of objects without any spacing between them. We do not ultimately come to know as perceiving subjects, right? Again, a transition, because that's reflective understanding. We become aware of the objects that are as representations, not as presentations, right? It's not really knowledge, it's still representations, representations, okay? So keep that in mind, that he's playing on this work right here always between representation, presentation, right? The reiteration, the repeatability of something, objects, etc., that takes place in reflective understanding. So let's go ahead with this. I'm just going to point out a couple of things in the, let's look at 130 before we go on. In Perception, page 77 in the text, he says, the singular being of sense does indeed vanish in the dialectical movement of immediate certainty and becomes universality, but it is only a sensuous universality. My meaning has vanished, and perception takes the object as it is in itself, or as a universal as such. Singular being, therefore, emerges in the object as true singleness, as the in itself of the one, or as a reflectiveness into self. But this is a conditioned being for self, alongside which appears another being for self, the universality which is opposed to and conditioned by a singular being. But these two contradictory extremes are not merely alongside each other, but in a single unity, or in other words, the defining characteristic common to both, that is, vis-a-vis, being for self, is burdened with opposition generally, that is, it is at the same time not a being for self. The sophistry of perception seeks to save those moments from their contradiction, and it seeks to lay hold on the truth by distinguishing between the aspects, by sticking to the also and in the insofar, and finally by distinguishing the unessential aspect from an essence which is opposed to it. But these expedients in perception, right, in the sophistry of perception, prove themselves, on the contrary, to be quite empty. And the truth which is supposed to be one by this logic of the perceptual process proves to be in one and in the same respect the opposite of itself, and thus to have as its essence a universality which is devoid of distinctions and determinations. This is what Hegel is going to call the unconditioned universal, right? The unconditioned universal. These empty extractions of singleness and the universality opposed to it, and of an essence that is linked with something unessential, a non-essential aspect which is necessary. These are powers whose interplay is the perceptual understanding. What I put on the board, part of the reflective, often called sound common sense. Takes itself to be a solid, realistic consciousness is, in the perceptual process, only the play of these abstractions. Okay? This is interesting, that still you think you have the perception or the perspectival moment. You don't. You're really lost and mired in abstractions. Generally, it is always at its poorest when it fancies itself to be the richest. When someone says, I see now, or something like that, usually means they're very poor in what they're, observing and where they are. Bandying about these vacuous essences, thrown in the arms first of one and then of the other, and striving by its sophistry to hold fast and affirm alternately first of the essences and then the directly opposite one, it sets itself against the truth and holds the opinion that philosophy is only concerned with mental entities. A matter of fact, really, philosophy does not have to do with them too, recognizing them as the pure essences, the absolute elements and powers as well, and is therefore master over them, whereas perpetual understanding, or what he calls sound common sense, takes them for truth and is led by them from one error to another. Okay? Very important again that this perceptual consciousness, right, that is going on here, this reflective perceptual understanding in terms of its own sophistry, right, is liable to lead you to error, right, in any kind of knowledge of the things themselves, right? Okay? And then he goes on to say, it does not itself become conscious. It is simple essentialities of this kind that hold sway over it, but fancies that it always has to do with wholly substantial material and content, just as sense certainty is unaware that the empty abstraction of pure being is its essence. Okay? So we're going back to sense certainty, if you remember, the 0 point, pure being, right? Do you remember this, right? The empty abstraction of pure being. But it is, in fact, these essentialities within which perceptual understanding runs to and fro through every kind of material and content, the cohesive power and mastery over that content, and they are alone are what the sensuous is as essence for consciousness. They are what determines the relations of the sensuous to it, and it is in them that the process of perception and its truth runs its course. This course of perpetual alteration of determining what is true and then setting aside this determining constitutes, strictly speaking, the steady, everyday life and activity of perpetual consciousness, perceptual consciousness, a consciousness which fancies itself to be moving in the realm of truth. It advances uninterruptedly to the outcome in which all these essentialities are determining are equally set aside, but at each single moment is conscious only of this one determinateness as the truth. Not the multiplicity. For Hegel, the truth is always multiple determinations. And this is something that Althusser is very well aware of when he writes the famous essay over determination and contradiction. Right? Very, very important. It does indeed suspect their own essentiality, and to save them from the danger threatening them, it resorts to the sophistry of asserting to be true when it has just declared itself to be untrue. What the nature of these untrue essences is really trying to get perceptual understanding to do is to bring together and supersede the thoughts of these non-entities. The thoughts of that universality and singular being of also in one of the essentiality that is necessarily linked to the unessential moment, and of an unessential moment that yet is necessary. But the understand struggles to avoid this by resorting to, insofar as, and to the various aspects, or making itself responsible for one thought in order to keep the other one isolated as the true one. But the very nature of these abstractions brings them together of its own accord. It is sound common sense that is the prey of these abstractions, which spin it round and round in the whirling circle. When common sense tries to make them true, by at one time making itself responsible for their untruth, while another time it calls their deceptiveness a semblance of the unreliability of things and separate what is essential from what is necessary to them, yet supposedly unessential, holding the former to be their truth is against the latter. When it does this, it is not secure, but convicts itself of their own truth. Okay? So, in propositional form, perception ultimately is a grand illusion, a grand lie, right? In this perceptual reflective understanding, right? And this is why he has to go on, right, to the next level of the dialectic, when he says, in the dialectic of sense certainty, seeing and hearing have been lost to consciousness, the relinquishment, and as perception, consciousness is arrived at thoughts. Okay? All right? Right? Which it brings together for the first time in what he calls the unconditional universe. So this begins this new section on force and understanding. Okay? So you want to stop for a second? I mean, any thoughts about this? What I'd like you to see here is that he's going through our processes of seeing and hearing, and saying this is not enough, right? We want one step, we're only arriving at perception and at thoughts, right? We only have thoughts, right, in the abstract at this point, and we're not yet at the level of really true purposeful understanding or understanding that will lead us to consciousness, right? So he just doesn't want us awakened, right? He wants us to go through these steps. The intention is to go through the steps in the dialectic that makes us come beyond, you no longer can see and hear like you used to. Mm-hmm. It's like the old adage, you got to give up your parents and all those codes if you really want to hear Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk play. If you really want to hear the depth of that kind of level, you've got to give up the codes of the past, right? In a sense. Hegel is saying somewhat the same thing here. You've got to give up these codes that you become so accustomed to, and in many ways, all right? So, anyway, this is going into number 3. There are 3 sections, again, to this section called consciousness, Bewusstsein, right? The first, of course, again, sense certainty, or the this and meaning, right? How do we get this in a sense, right? The sense, seeing, right, and hearing. And then, of course, perception is the second one that we, somewhat have gone over, right? Right? The types of cycles that it goes through. So perception brings awareness. You can perceive something and be aware of something, but for Hegel, you have not yet made the movement to self-certainty and the movement towards self-consciousness. Right? Right? Mm-hmm. Okay? To the moment. This is the moment. Again, to go back to the temporality, and I'll have to do this too at some time. It's not enough time tonight. Right? We're going to go through moments, right? Yeah, versus the nukstans, right? And then we're going to go through what he calls the instants. The instant, right? Right? The instant versus the moment, right? We're going to be dealing with moments. And we use this word a lot. Let's see what Hegel, means by it in terms of self-consciousness when we get to it. Yeah? Remember, moment also reflects momentum. You're also going to have momentum in a moment, right? And it's not only just the moment and its fixity, it's the movement and that momentum that it's going on. Yeah. Right. Okay? So, how do you want to go about this? I mean, should we read Force and the Understanding? I mean, I can talk a little bit about, he distinguishes between 2 forces, right? And really the thing is, how do you link the underlying supersensible essence with the appearance themselves? That's really the task in this section, right? Yeah. Okay? So reflective understanding always underlies our perceptual awareness, right, with a representation of objects. Yep. This is what reflective understanding does. But, what about, if you will, force, right? You want to start with force? I mean, the 2 types of force? Is that a reasonable starting point?
Sure. Okay.
Well, the first type of force is the non-substantialist type of force, right? And he gives the example, if you will, in the encyclopedia of a magnetic force and the bearer of the iron, right? So you have the iron and the magnetic force, and the movement, right, of the iron, right, is also in the drive, if you will, or is part of the movement of the magnetic force, right, is an extension or an expression of the force, right? So both the magnet and the iron, the force itself and the iron as force, are become one in this non-substantialist thing. Do you understand that? I mean, so you're looking at an object, iron, right, and magnetic as one, not as 2, right? It's not the force that moved you or the spirit that moved you. Mm-hmm. It was both, right? Mm-hmm. Right? The object and the force together. So he's thinking about this in this non-substantialist way. The other one is the metaphysical force. And he'll go through this in terms of, he'll talk about the one that, has a multiplicity of appearances. This is the force that's underlying everything. And he calls it a metaphysical force, right? He's not gonna do anything. So that has a passive and an active thing working with it. He uses examples of centrifugal and centripetal and, as I mentioned, inertia and all of that. Let me see if I can find the sections. Okay, so let me go through some of the key terms here. Section 134, the result, right, was the unconditioned universal initially in the negative and abstract sense that consciousness negated its one-sided notions. It's not just the magnetic iron, right? Or the iron, right? And abstracted them. In other words, it gave them up, it relinquishes. But the result, a positive significance, in it the unity of being for self and being for another is posited. In other words, the absolute antithesis is posited as a self-identical essence. Do you guys do you understand this? I mean, he's really saying the thesis and the antithesis, the one and the other, right? Self and other are one and the same here. Mm-hmm. The antithetical is together. To use Adorno as an example, Adorno, will say, my writings are by nature antithetical. Adorno has already positioned himself outside completely of the system, as an antithetical moment of which consciousness of self, being for self, as well as being for another, have collapsed into one. Okay? And it becomes the antithetical, in a way. You see this in the negative dialectics. You see this also in aesthetic theory. That the aesthetic theory, and we'll maybe hopefully go through this a little bit on Saturday in Stanley's class, that in aesthetic theory, that the main thing is not to reduplicate images of the past, not to recycle, right? And the only way you can do that is to step completely outside. So the argument against Brechtian drama, that you're distantiating yourself to the objective spectator who is active, in the play, but doesn't identify in the play, is still within the realm of being able to be recuperated and recaptured by the system. It's not fully antithetical. Do you understand this? You can't be doubled, right? You can't be the dédoublement, the doubling does not take place. So when Rimbaud, for example, says, I am another, this is what Hegel's really saying. It's a great, great moment of Rimbaud. I am another, right? Outside of oneself, right? You're constituting, and again, we've talked a little bit about that. You are the object, right? In a sense. And that's the position you're working from. But let's go. Self-identical essence. Do you understand? No, not really? Or tell me what's the
you're not the object. You're the force. You're the mediating thing between the object
you're both.
Exactly.
You're
you
both.
Can't just say
it's
you're
both
the object.
It's both.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not just saying you're the object, but you are the object too. Yeah, you are the object.
Exactly.
Yes, two.
Or in between, maybe.
Well, I don't. That would presuppose mediation right away. Mm-hmm. There's going to be mediation, of course, mm-hmm. But first of all, you are both subject and object, right? Yeah. You're looking at how can you get out. That perception is a step along that way, right? To be outside, right? But still stays within reflective understanding. Now we're trying to get to the force and understanding how this is going to cut into this and what underlies all of this. What's the underlying one? Unity. And for Hegel, it's a unity of multiplicities. So you're both subject and object.
Yeah.
Okay?
Or you're an expression of force.
Well, you're an expression of force always. Yes, that's right. He's looking at expression. And, for those of you that are interested in this too, the theory of expression and how that works, Deleuze's great seminar on Spinoza in 1968, the theory of expression in Spinoza, the theory of expressionism, which is now in English, it's been translated. It's a reading of the ethics of Spinoza, really through, in some ways, not really through Hegel, but he uses certain terminology. expressionism in philosophy, and this is coming very much from this section. Okay? All right. So, okay, at first sight, this seems to concern only the forms, and this is where you were, Josh, right? Only the form of the moments in reciprocal relation.
Right.
Right? But being for self and being for another are the content itself as well. Right? Since the antithesis in its truth can have no other nature than the one yielded in the result. Vis-a-vis that the content taken in perception to be true belongs only in fact to the form in the unity in which it is dissolved. This content is likewise universal. There can be no other content which by the particular constitution would fail to fall within this unconditioned universality. A content of this kind would be some particular way or other of being for itself and being in relation to another. But in general, to be for itself and to be in relation to other constitutes the nature and the essence of the content, whose truth consists in its being unconditionally universal, and the result is simply and solely universal.
So so the unconditioned universal is its form. Could you say that?
It's the unconditioned universal. It's the principle on which. What's that?
They're basically the same.
Form and content.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Same in content. Right.
Form and content.
Form and content are the same.
I get it.
Right? There's no distinction.
Right.
The form is the content is the form.
He
The
says
crucial word
it in
is
such
the
a way
is.
that you're spending your time
Is the is.
is.
Well, I'm sorry?
He says it in such a way that it's very hard to at least to know.
Yes, but it
Yeah.
ultimately can be reduced to that the content is the form or the form is the content,
Yeah.
right? So when you take a formalist approach, and this is where a lot of the formalist readers come out, is really coming out of this section of Hegel too. Yeah. The form is the content is the form.
Right.
Now listen, I don't want to be tautological with this, but the is very important. You have to be able to see these levels of mediation and the way it unfolds, etc. So anyway, all right. All right. So, and then what is sublated here? So we have this force, this non-substantialist force, right? Okay, so let's look at the other thing, right? He talks about 136. One moment then appears as the essence that is stepped to one side as a universal medium or as the subsistence of independent matters. But the independence of these matters is nothing else than this medium. In other words, the unconditioned universal is simple and solely the plurality of diverse universals of this kind. That within itself, the universal is an undivided unity within this plurality means, however, that these matters are each where the other is. They mutually interpenetrate. And this is very important, the interpenetration of opposites. Very, very important here, right? But without coming into contact with one another, because conversely, the many diverse matters are equally independent. This also means they're absolutely porous or are sublated. They can be aufhebend, right? Yeah. The porosity allows for that aufhebend. Right? So, in other words, right? The reduction of the diversity to pure being for itself is nothing other than the medium itself, and this is the independence of the different matters. In other words, the matters posited as independent directly pass over into their unity, and their unity directly unfolds its diversity, and this once again reduces itself to unity. Again, we're going towards the unity of multiplicity, right? Very, very important, the unity of multiple determinations. It's ridiculous to reduce anything to one cause for Hegel, right? You're always looking at a series of multiple determinations, right? Or the moments of multiple, right? One of its moments, the dispersal of the independent matters in their immediate being, is that the expression of force. And this is the first time we get, but force taken as that in which they have disappeared is proper force. And that I call non-substantialist force. Force which has been driven back into itself from its expression. First, however, the force which is driven back into itself must express itself, and secondly, is still force remaining within itself in the expression, just as much as it is expression in the self-containedness. Right? So this is the first time he uses the word kratom. So when we thus preserve the two moments in their immediate unity, the understanding to which the notion of force belongs, okay? So to the concept, right, the understanding is the ground on which the concept of force belongs, is strictly speaking the notion which suspends the different moments, qua different, for in themselves they are not supposed to be different. Consequently, the difference exists only in thought. That is to say, what has been posited in the foregoing is in the first instance only the concept of force, not its reality. Okay? In point of fact, however, force is the unconditional universal, which is equally in its own self what it is for another. Right? Or which contains the difference in its own self, for difference is nothing else than being for another. Yeah? You know, you can take this and destroy identity politics. Right? In order then that force may in truth be, it must be completely set free from thought. It must be posited, and this is interesting, as the substance. I'm on page 82, I'm sorry, Phil. As of these differences, page 82, i.e. that is, first the substance as this whole force, remaining essentially in it for itself, and then its differences as possessing substantial being, or as moments existing on their own account. Force as such, or as driven back into self, thus exists on its own account as an exclusive one, in which the unfolding of the different matters is another subsisting essence, and thus two distinct independent aspects are set up. But force is also the whole. It remains what it is according to its notion. That is to say, these differences remain pure forms, superficial, vanishing moments. Right? At the same time, there would be no difference at all between force proper, which has been driven back into itself, and force unfolded into independent matters, if they had no enduring being, or there would be no force if it did not exist in those opposite ways. But that it does exist in these opposite ways simply means that the two moments are at the same time themselves independent. It is therefore this movement of the two moments in which they perpetually give themselves independence and then supersede themselves again, which we are now to consider. Okay? So he's set up this non-substantialist, notion of force and the metaphysical, right? So you have two types of forces he's going to engage here, right? Yeah. Yeah. The underlying. Right? So one which can be part of these vanishing moments, right? That he speaks about. The first type, right? Of force, essentializing, and then the underlying metaphysical, in which we see the unity of multiplicities. Key word, the unity, the bringing together of multiplicities. Yeah, back to the one. I know we didn't do Parmenides this week, but it'll be interesting to look at what Hegel says about Parmenides, the one and the many. And, the Greek philosophy is really about the one. And really in a Hegel, in a longer sense, and this is my prejudice speaking, is really working through what's been called henology, the thinking or the study of the one. Yeah, in the tradition of philosophy, right? He's always thinking through the one vis-a-vis contradiction, through the force of contradiction, right? Think about contradiction. You have rational contradictions in reason, pragmatic contradictions, in practical affairs, these kind of contradictions, right? You have these kind of contradictions always at work, right? You have the formal contradictions as well, right? In terms of form and formal logic, etc., right? So you have the formal, the pragmatic, and the rational, the three basic contradictions that are always going on, in a sense, right? And of course, how do you read capital? We have to read capital always at all three levels. What are the practical consequences of the pragmatic contradictions, right, that are happening? What are the rational contradictions of the system itself, right? And what are its formal contradictions, which actually opens up a kind of new theory of law? How does this take form? What are the forms that are taking place? And this sets up, in my opinion, the relations between base superstructure, legal ideology in particular. Very interesting to look at it that way, in a sense. Yeah, you want to say something? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I'm listening. Yeah, fine.
I have nothing to say.
Okay. But I mean, I'm just trying to lay this out a little bit. I mean, I don't, I know it's very dense. And I know the language is hard because there's so many compounded sentences. I mean, they're clearly, meant to confuse, or as Sean pointed out, he probably could have said it in one sentence instead of going through a whole paragraph to get to the
I kind of have it set up as a opposition
Yeah, go ahead. You can go set
force
something.
proper and the expression of force.
Okay.
And that,
Well, this is the expression,
right,
the unity of multiplicities,
okay, I see, there we go.
right? Just a different, yeah.
Mhm.
But the expression is the unity of multiple determinations and of multiplicities.
Right, the plurality
Right?
of different
Whereas the
matter
expression in the non-substantialist is not. So, right?
driven back into itself.
Okay? Yeah, it goes back into itself.
Yeah.
Okay? Does that make it more understandable? I mean, a little, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have like a nice chart.
Okay, good. I'd like to see that. Tell us about it. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's basically just what you mapped out there, but
Well, no, it's okay. I mean, I'm
But in
sure
a
your
longer
chart's
form.
better than mine.
In a
You're
longer
the
form.
artist.
but what you get to is the totality as a whole, ultimately.
Well, yeah, I mean, all this is moving towards the totality, but
Yeah.
these are steps on the way.
Right.
How do you get to the totality? You just can't say, I see the totality. You know what I mean? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you have to understand that we're going through this sense certainty, right? And, we're going through the this and the thatness of meaning through sense certainty. We're relinquishing this kind of way of seeing through the sense certainty, right? We're relinquishing that. We're also going through perception in terms of this reflective understanding, right? We're trying to get beyond this perceptual understanding, how we both see and hear. So really, in a way, we're being, really transformed, right? Because he's trying to get away from quote unquote sensuous knowledge, sensuous appropriation of knowledge. Because he's saying this is not knowledge.
Yeah.
Right? Right? Yeah. Okay? So, I mean, this is really what he's trying to get away from. Yeah. This is thinking in the abstract. This is this is philosophical vampirism, all the blood's being sucked out of, the philosophical body in certain ways. Yeah. This is the monster at work. Right? I mean, really, yeah. Okay? So these are all steps towards what you call the totality, the whole, the all height, right? This is where we're going to go. Ultimately, to the all height or to the totality. Right? So what we're really going to do, what we're doing here, is we're going through these individual steps. I mean, I'm glad you brought this up. We're going through these individual subjective movements of subjective spirit, if you will, if you want to put it in this kind of terminology, in order that we can get to the sociability, if you will, of consciousness and reason. That we get into the social totality. So in a certain way, we're now dealing with totalities in thought, whereas once we get to consciousness and self-consciousness, the truth of sense certainty, we begin to take on now the social totality more. Okay? Yeah? And this is why Adorno, I mean, at least to my mind, I mean, I'm not saying this is the gospel by any means, I'm kind of reducing it here, but Adorno is basically, in some ways, saying the whole is the false. And the reason he's saying that is in the movement from these totality of thought and abstractions into the social totality, there's a break. There's a falsity that happens. We can never comprehend fully the totality. We cannot participate fully in the totality.
Right.
Now Heidegger tries to remedy this by using tools and instruments in being in time in terms of the totality of involvements. So this has a very rich history, this term you brought up, all height, and what we call, ultimately the totality, right? Right, this whole concept of the totality, right? Yeah, for Lukács, it's our way out of reification. Yeah. For Sartre, it's a way of us constituting movements, right? Getting out of the practical inert, right? In some ways. Yeah. Yeah. It's more than taking surveys and elections, right? Is the totality, all this thing. It's more than just covering all the bases. It's not the notion that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right, in some ways. It has a very different thing. And that's why I want you to kind of, go with the steps here, what Hegel's doing, between sense certainty, perception, and now force and the understanding. Because the understanding is a very crucial step, if you will, to the truth of sense certainty and consciousness. Coming to consciousness is really what he's trying to do here. Really coming to consciousness. Yeah. Okay?
It becomes clearer, like, as the further we go, actually.
Yeah, good.
I thought the beginning of this part, this force and understanding, is really what I had trouble with, actually getting to force, and understanding force, and then force against force.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Later, like, I sort of got it somewhere at like 141 or something.
I'm sorry, it's one of my
Or 142.
Yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
When I sort of started thinking of it more like you were saying in Adorno's terms, like subject and object, or...
Yeah, I would think it through in terms of subject to object, and thinking through the totality, and especially this term when he's going, because he's really trying to go to this, what I put up here earlier, the Übercyclic, right? How do you supersede or overcome, right? Right, this here, right?
Yeah.
Sensibility, the super sensibility or super sensible, right? In a sense, which is not a great translation because you're also going towards the sensible as well. You have to remember, dialectics is always, for Hegel, and especially even more so for Marx, it's movement, right? It's movement. When Spinoza says all determination is negation, that's movement. You cannot move without negation. That's why anybody that says you're negative, you can just reply, I'm in movement, man. I'm in movement, right? The negative thinking, right? And Marcuse goes, so this is really, in a way, you have to think this relationally and think it dialectically, right, together, right? Okay? So try to think it both, right? That you're always in this movement of over determining, right? Right? The sensible, right? At the same time, you're going towards it, but you're also overcoming it, right? Into thought, right? And abstraction, right? But that's on the way towards understanding, towards this here, towards this Verstanden, right? Right? And its relationship to this. And these two that you very accurately point out, the non-substantialist thing where it collapses back into itself, right? And secondly of all, the metaphysical underlying force, right? Listen, I'll tell you a story. Goethe, I don't know if you've read Faust by Goethe. You've read Faust, right? In the beginning, he's translating the Bible. And what does he say? In the beginning was the Word. He scratches that out. The second thing he comes, in the beginning was the Spirit. He crosses that out. In the beginning was the force. He almost lives Crofton, but he comes up with one other word. In the beginning was the deed. Praxis. So you can kind of read this in a way as, Wort, right? Geist, You know, I mean, if you really want to think it through, think about this kind of movement, you know. And praxis, right? Word, spirit, force, and praxis, action. In the beginning was the deed, is what he really comes up with, and I retranslated it as practice, right?
Better.
As praxis.
Better.
Right? So think about this. This is the advent of Romanticism, right, in a way. You know, I mean, Goethe is the high romantic. Goethe in his age is the high romanticism. The thinker of the state is Goethe. Kleist is not the thinker of the state. You know, if you think of this dramatically, Kleist is much more radical. When you think about Penthesilea, you know, the marionettes, the life of the marionettes, he's much more against the state. He's much more satirical. Whereas Goethe is kind of privileging it. The apprenticeship of Wilhelm Meister, you know, of course, Faust is a reconciliation, sort of at the end. So think of this as a relationship, too, that you're in a conversation like between Mephistopheles and Faust. You know, in many ways, that's going on in this, quote, philosophical novel of initiation, this Bildung Roman, right? At one level. At the same time, Hegel wants to overcome Romanticism. So this is another thing. There's no, no punching going on anymore around or rope-a-dope with the noble soul, with the bel âme. You know, the noble soul is no longer a privileged moment in Hegelian phenomenology. It's reason, and reason supreme after consciousness and the master-slave dialectic. And and Kojève is a very good example of this, who becomes the state helmsman at the end, right, in a way, as a Hegelian. I'm not Hegelian, I'm trying to understand him again, and see what's going on. But tell me more that you're thinking about. This is a crucial chapter, but I hope you see, look, if you think of force, just not like we think of force, but as non-substantialist, but at the same time as an underlying metaphysical force, right, if you will, right, as principle, that is actually moving, right, the underlying here, so, and it's really ultimately multiplicities a series of multiplicities, if you will, or multiple determinations. And what's going on. That's its metaphysics, right?
So,
Please.
Could you say, for Nietzsche, force in maybe a way that Hegel would call non-dialectical would be will to power as this kind of underlying
I think
force
Nietzsche takes a further dimension here.
Okay.
To the will, yeah.
But is that kind of what we're talking about with force?
Yes, well, will to power, for Heidegger, and those who are really good, careful readers of Nietzsche, once again, you have two central concepts, right? Metaphysical principle, and one is will to power in Nietzsche. The other is the eternal recurrence of the same.
So these would be these kind of movements underneath.
Well, this is underlying all the way, right? This becomes symptomatic, in my opinion. I read this as a parodic attempt of Nietzsche just last. The first time is tragedy, the second time is farce, the third time is pastiche, right? And he can come up with new forms,
What is the third
Who knows what we're in here? What's up? I'm sorry?
What's that term right there? Insane? Is that what you wrote?
No, the same.
The same.
The sameness. Same and other. No, going back to the essence in itself, right? The sameness.
Yeah. So
the 12 bell strokes of noon, you have to chew the head of the snake, right, and bite the head of the serpent in terms of the circularity of history, so that you do not keep going through these same things twice.
Yeah.
Right? This is Nietzsche at work. When Dylan rewrites that, how much do I have to pay to keep from going through these same things twice, is really a Nietzschean comment on the eternal recurrence of the same. History eternally recurs, right? He wanted to mathematize this. He believed in this so much, he went to the university and went to a mathematician and said, I think I have the answer, the riddle to existence. Eternal recurrence of the same. Yeah. So yes, but good thing. So power, is more powerful than force, right? Macht in German, right? Nietzsche says the metaphysical principle, this is what Heidegger says we end up with in the metaphysical sending or destiny of the West.
Because power is not really dialectical, is it?
Well, yes, of course. Power, counter-power,
Yeah, I guess.
power over, yes, yeah.
So Heidegger like temporalizes it, like said this is a specific thing that happens in the West.
Western metaphysics ends with a closure. One reason to read Hegel is that this book, in some ways, alongside the logic, represents the closure of Western metaphysics.
Right.
The Hegelian system has recapitulated the history of Western philosophy, and this book is one of the landmarks in this, one of the reasons it should be core in any kind of educational institution, right? Because it is symptomatic of the Western metaphysical tradition, right? From Plato to Hegel. I, Plato, am the truth, to Hegel, I, Plato, I, Hegel, am the truth, right? Both think of truth and representation in the same breath, right? Both, in some ways, Hegel more so, is a great system builder. That the system does not allow, why Derrida, risk something that I had up here earlier, go out, the risk against the system. Can you break the system? Or does he trap you? To me, the image I always have is Zarathustra. I would love to do a course on this. Animals in Zarathustra, animals in Hegel. Does Zarathustra walk in the shadow of the wise owl of Minerva, Hegel, that reflects, on the days of end and dusk? So for Heidegger, and for some others, Hegel represents that dusk of philosophy when all the games, right, all the meanings, skepticism, all the consciousnesses, skepticism, stoicism, the unhappy consciousness, which is Christianity, etc., take shapes as forms of consciousness, right? You begin to read the whole history of philosophy in these kind of shapes and forms, right? As well as its concatenation of arguments. And this is the closure of the Western representation of philosophy. So the task after that, that's why Marx says, Hegel is a dead dog. Philosophy is a dead dog for Marx, right? In a way. He's well aware of this, after the Kantian Hegelian systems, right? Nietzsche comes along and says, well, let's hold off for a minute here too. We need to talk about consciousness. Is consciousness an empty fiction? So you have the subterranean, this is very complicated, but it's a good story. That Spinoza, Nietzsche, right, are kind of underlying all of this, saying there's no such thing as consciousness, right? It's just material, to go back to what you're saying, force and power at work, right? Determination, negation, moving through, and we build from there, right? So the consciousness does not figure into the equation of Nietzsche, nor of Spinoza.
Would sort of be like buying into the illusion of the consciousness.
For Nietzsche, Hegel is buying into the illusion of consciousness and the ego. Yeah, because it evaporates. It's vanishing. It doesn't stick, right, in a certain way. But again, Nietzsche is not a substantialist thinker. So there's non-substantialism right here in terms of the early part of force, Nietzsche would probably agree with. Right? In a way. Right? So anyway, what?
No, nothing.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. I don't know. I guess I would just hesitate to put force and power together, but.
Put what? Force and power? No,
Yeah.
I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that. I'm trying to separate it because I think power is much different than force, and especially in German too. The Will to Power was written as a series of aphorisms that was a kind of pretext, an outline for a work on political philosophy. This is his attempt to rewrite Plato's Republic, but really to rewrite Machiavelli. This is what he really wanted to do in the Will to Power.
Yeah, no, I wasn't trying to say they were the same. I guess I was trying to use it as a comparison to elucidate better for myself if it's a different way of tracking this sort of subterranean movements of things. If that was kind of what Hegel was doing, but for Hegel, you wouldn't like separate the thing from the movement in the same kind of
Nietzsche's
way.
anti-epistemological. That's a major difference than Hegel. He's about the gay science, how to live well, right? How to be happy in a certain way, how to unfold into one's destiny. At the same time, he's not interested in absolute knowing, right? He's not interested in this journey of absolute. Remember, the journey here is the circle that begins in the preface, the prefatory remarks, and the introduction of doing philosophy differently, that you're going to be able to come full circle into absolute knowing. That your promise here is through all of these, dialectical spheres unfolding, that you're going to get to the point of where you begin to see absolute knowledge.
Right, no, I understand that. I'm just more like trying to look specifically at what force is and grasp that more specifically. So my question was more like, it's sort of this like movement at work within things that are like, when we're talking about like this metaphysical.
Well, it's a dialectical movement. I mean, in the sense, again, he uses the example of the iron and the magnet, right? That is a dialectical relationship of which force is in both. Right? It's just not the iron and it's just not the magnet, right? It's going on. Or the electrical charge between, it is part of that unity of the multiplicity, right? It becomes a metaphysical principle, but in the beginning it's non-substantialist as force. Right? Yeah.
So eventually, there's two different forces, but eventually we just take both of them together as force.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then he talks about solicitation of force.
Right.
Which is another interesting concept, the kind of solicitation of force. As
Force
well, which starts in, Proposition 138, etc. Right? How do you apprehend the truth, right? Right? He's really trying to get here. I mean, look, maybe this will help a little bit. We're in the realm of subjective spirit still. Okay? We're still in the realm of the Geist as subjectivity, right? And he's going to try to move us out of that, and he's doing so through these movements of subject-object together. Right? In a sense. So you can't just say that's objective or that's subjective. There's always this movement and this attempt trying to come back. Because he's constructing, think about how this is constructed. We're going to go, this chapter, these three chapters, sense certainty, and the this and that and meaning, right? Perception, right? Or the thing, that's deceived, right? That deceives. And third, force and understanding, and overcoming the supersensible, or the supersensible, the logic of appearance and the supersensible. Well, look, the key term really here with force is appearance. As Josh said, expression, but the key term is really appearance. How one earth shine moon, right? How something shines forth, appears, right? English is very limited philosophically sometimes. This is an old battle in philosophy, the longest story in philosophy, the difference, the movement of reality and appearance since Plato, since the cave.
Right.
Yeah, since the sun illuminates appearance. Right? Which
Okay.
for Plato was yeah?
Think.
You think? Yeah, no, it's okay. I mean, we're gonna when we get there, we'll get there. It's all right. This is lifelong stuff. Yeah. I may wake up at 80 one day. Oh, finally, eureka.
I just think it's weird that he started with force, with this super abstract.
Because it's part of the scientific discussion of his day.
Yeah.
He's trying to be smart. He's trying to be cute.
Because it gets clear
it's
later.
like Arto with molecular biology. Arto doesn't know much about it. I mean, I love Arto, but he's not an expert on molecular biology. But he wants to use molecular biology. Everybody wants to be, quote, in the moment, right? So Hegel's no different in that respect. They're talking about this stuff in physics and in Faraday, Maxwell is about to appear on the scene. You have all these things that are happening around force. That's why he entitles the chapter force, right? And when I mentioned the inertia versus acceleration, this is in the discussion. Centripetal and centrifugal forces at work, right? Planetary motion. This is going on since Copernicus. Right? Think about this. If you read on the revolutionary orbit of the planets, how much force is involved in that moment, right? In that discourse.
Yeah.
Force and Galileo.
If you put it that way, yeah.
Yeah.
And then he's
But I mean,
responding
yeah, of
to
course.
Kant
I mean,
and Newton and all these people too. I
Yeah, of
guess.
course. Well, Newton's dominant
Right.
at this period.
Right.
You know, and it's like Heidegger with the note on the note and being in time, and the footnote
Right.
is really about Einstein.
Right.
Heidegger's taking over this, taking on this. Go back and read footnote 80 to section 82
Yeah.
in Being in Time. You'll begin to see the confrontation with Hegelian temporality. Yeah.
I see.
And also Derridian confrontation with Heideggerian and Hegelian temporality. Because if you think of this, again, look, and this is the great thing about Kojève, he's the first to bring in this equation, time, right? And life and death, time and death in Hegel. Before that, it was all about knowledge, step to knowledge. But he brings in the temporality of knowledge as well, these temporal sequences, etc. Yeah. What is really happening here? So anyway, I think listen, it's not going to be as clear as the color of your toothpaste after the day to your sense certainty. I'm sorry, anyway, or it's not going to be as clear as the light of day. But bear with it. Like I said, in a sense, right? I mean, if you look at 148, right? For example, on page 89, the understanding, which is our object, finds itself in just this position, that the sensuous world is the really actual, that the inner world has come into being for it to begin with only as the universal, still unfulfilled in itself. The play of forces has merely this negative significance of being in itself nothing, and its only positive significance that of being the mediating agency, but outside of the understanding. He's capitalizing understanding here. It's not lowercase, Verstand, right? Verstandum, it's uppercase. With the inner world through the mediation, however, its own movement through which the inner world will fill itself out for the understanding. What is immediate for the understanding is the play of forces, the immediate. But what is the true for it is the simple inner world. The movement of force is therefore the true, likewise, only as something altogether simple. We have seen, however, the display of forces is so constituted that the force which is solicited by another force is equally the soliciting force for that other, which only thereby becomes itself a soliciting force. What is present in this interplay is likewise merely the immediate alternation or the absolute interchange of the determinateness which constitute the sole content of what appears. Again, this is about appearance, the expression of appearance. To be either universal medium, right, or a negative unity. It seizes immediately on its appearance in determinate form to be what it was on appearing. By appearing in determinate form, it solicits the other side to express itself. The latter is now immediately what the first was supposed to be. The relation of soliciting and the relation of the opposing determinate content is on its own account an absolute reversal and interchange of the determinateness. How do you flip something? This is really what he's talking about. How do you flip it? Yeah. How do you do an interrogation? Right here. It's very interesting. Yeah. When you really think about that, how do you get this relation of soliciting and the relationship of the opposite or opposed determinate content on its own or an absolute reversal and interchange of the determinateness? How do you get this going? Right? In some ways, right? Yeah. But these two relations are again one and the same, and the difference of form of being the solicited and the soliciting force is the same as the difference of content of being the solicitous force as such, vis-a-vis the passive medium on the one hand, and the soliciting force, the active negative unity on the other. So you have the passive and active forces working here too, right? In Nietzsche, it's just power.
Got it.
You don't have active and passive in Nietzsche that way. Not that way. Yep. Passive revolution in Gramsci is a dialectical concept that comes out of play of forces, the war of maneuver, the war of position. Think about this, some of the terms we use, in everyday parlance among the left. What is a war of position? It's a war of, a war of position. Position itself in the German Setzung, position is a war machine. When Hegel is using the word posit, it is a war machine at work. It's taking a position, right? It's taking a Setzung, right? In many ways. So think about this too. What's being posited here? Why he uses such words like nothingness, non-substantialist, right? What is being posited? You have to think always he's really gunning again. Presuppositionalist philosophy. Without, we're supposed to know. We're not subjects supposed to know here. We're subjects supposed to not know. To play on my copy. So that we can actually get to the knowledge itself. Okay? In a certain way. Okay? So this is the anti-Lacanianism of Hegel. Hegel reading Lacan in some ways. Lacan always talks about the analyst is the sujet that's supposed to know. The subject's supposed to know, which he doesn't. The analyst never really knows. That's the beauty of the field, right?
Yeah.
You're not supposed to know.
Right.
Yeah. You're like Tiresias, the blind soothsayer, guiding, giving signs, giving clues, etc. So anyway, I don't know if that helps, right? And then he's going to go into force and law.
Yeah.
Which is interesting too.
What about the syllogisms?
Thematic and the syllogisms. Well, I think we should leave that
for
when Arto does the syllogisms, and I can bring it back. But anyway, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Cool.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the section on the void.
The which one?
Section on the void.
Okay.
But I guess we can do that with the syllogism.
No, I don't mind doing the section on the void. But remember, he puts up Faraday here too, right? Mm-hmm. He talks about electricity. Right, in 93, right? He has the law, this is on 152, proposition 152, page 92. The law is thereby present in a twofold manner, right? This is important as well. Once as a law in which the differences are expressed as independent moments, right? And also in the form of a simple withdrawal into itself, which again can be called force. So, Mia, going back to what you said, think about it this way. Hegel has both internal and external force working all the time here, right? In a sense, right? And that is not driven back into self, but a force as such, or the notion of force, an abstraction, which absorbs the differences themselves of what attracts and what is attracted. In this sense, what is it? The force? Simple electricity. Right? Simple electricity. For example, is force, but the expression of difference falls within the law. The difference is positive and negative electricity. In the case of the motion of falling, force is the simple factor, gravity, whose law is that the magnitudes of the different moments of the motion, the time elapsed, and the space traversed are related to one another as root and square. Electricity itself is not difference per se, or is not in its essence the dual essence of positive and negative electricity. Hence, it is usually said that it has the law of this mode of being, and two, that it has the property of expressing itself this way. Good, huh?
It's a good example.
It's a very good example.
It makes it pretty clear.
Simple electricity on the law of force, right?
Yep.
Yep, okay. It is true that this property is the essential and sole property of force, or that it belongs to it necessarily. But necessity here is an empty word. Force must, just because it must, duplicate itself in this way. Of course, given positive electricity, negative too is given in principle. For the positive is only is related to a negative, or the positive is in its own self the difference from itself, and similarly with the negative. But electricity as such to divide itself in this way, right, is not in itself a necessity. Electricity as simple force is indifferent to its law, right? to be positive and negative. And if we call the former its notion and the latter its being, then its notion is indifferent to its being. It merely has this property, which just means that this property is not in itself necessary to it. This indifference is given in another form, which can be said positive and negative belongs to the definition of electricity. You can't just say someone's electric, right? That's a misnomer for Hegel, right? You have to talk about the positive and the negative together, right? Right? And this is simply its notion and essence. In that case, its being would simply mean its actual existence. But that definition does not contain the necessity of its existence. It exists either because we find it, that is, its existence is not necessary at all, or it exists through or by means of other forces. Its necessity is an external necessity. But in basing this necessity on the determinateness of being through another, we relapse again into the plurality of specific laws which we have left behind to consider, quote unquote, the law as law. Right? It is only with law as law that we are compared its notion as notion or its necessity. But in all these forms, necessity has shown itself only to be an empty word. Right? Okay? So this is a good section here to get you, going on, what force is vis-a-vis, electricity. Right? And then he goes in the indifference of law and force, the example of a notion and being is to be found. The law of motion is necessary that motion be split up into space and time. So we have electricity, positive and negative, motion, space and time, or again into distance and velocity. Thus, since motion is only the relation of these factors, the universal is certainly divided in its own self. Now these parts, time and space, our distance and velocity, do not in themselves express their origin in the one, they are indifferent to each other. Space is thought of able to be without time, time without space, and distance at least without velocity. Just as their magnitudes are indifferent to one another, since they are not related to one another as positive and negative, and thus are not related to one another through their own essential nature. The necessity of the division is thus certainly present here, but not the necessity of the parts as such for one another. But this is just for this reason, the first necessity, too, is itself only a sham, a false necessity. For motion is not itself thought of as something simple, as a pure essence, but as already divided, right? Motion as divided. Time and space are in themselves its independent parts or essences, either of which we can be well without the other, and motion is therefore only their superficial relation, not their essence. If it is thought of as a simple essence or as force, motion is no doubt gravity, but this does not contain these differences at all. Okay? I think this is a very important group of examples here, right? If you begin to think about, we always talk about time and space, but we don't talk about time and space in terms of motion and as divided motion, right?
Yeah.
Start thinking of things this way, because it's really trying to alter, the way you think. Listen, you'll go crazy a little bit, but it's okay. It's not the worst thing in the world, okay? So, here we go. I'm going crazy. So think about this. Any thoughts, Josh, on this? I think this is a very good section. Yeah.
No.
No?
That's a great section. I don't have anything to add. Sorry.
He's not talking about power.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
it's okay. I'm just
I got what you meant.
You don't have to be sorry. I understand what you're saying. I understand how we like force and power together. I got you.
No,
I
I just
like it
meant,
too.
is it like he's talking about the underlying thing beneath things? I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I was in a class once, many years ago, and I was teaching Oedipus. And I had a group of very, very smart black students. So one guy raises his hand. We're talking about Oedipus. He says, "Professor, you know what I think? I think that woman had the papers on him." I said, well, that's a very good materialistic reading of the play, right? So in a way, yeah, I mean, listen, nothing's foreign to philosophical discourse, and no, it's a very good thing. I mean, we always associate basically force and power together. You know, certainly in English we do. Yeah, but in German, the will to power for Nietzsche, once again, will to power in Nietzsche's case was a look at values, right? How you reevaluate value thinking, right? It was not about how we know.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I'm
no,
just trying
I
to
think
separate the
I said
two.
it in a way that was confusing about what I meant, and let's just pretend it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
I know, like more, it's like the movement in things, like the kind of like energy of things, in a way.
Okay.
Is that anyway, never mind, I'm sorry.
Power and energy? Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Force and energy? Yes, of course. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure he has that in mind, right? I mean, in some ways. But the will to power, first of all, is a collection that's symptomatic of values. It's an attempt to reevaluate value systems, right? And what's happening there is the power configurations, you know, what he calls, what is it, Herrschaften, Bildung, right? The play of master and image cultural formations, how that plays out in history, and then how that power takes hold. So today, if Nietzsche was alive, he would say we're directed by a priestly class. Marx, of course, would say the ruling class controls the priestly class, but Nietzsche would think the priestly class is even more dangerous in a way because it's the one that creates and perpetuates values. Whereas the rulers, you know, hire these people to keep the ruling ideology going, right?
I guess I misunderstood. I thought for him it was this sort of like metaphysical principle, like the way like the movement of a gene would be like the energy of a thing that's underlying like the biological sort of movement of the appearance.
That's one reading you can do. I don't really subscribe to that reading as Nietzsche as a biological or as a metaphysical principle.
Right.
I don't really subscribe to the Heideggerian reading in a way either. I see it much more as a political task in Nietzsche for my purposes. You know, I mean, I'm not Heidegger or, I'm not Nietzsche, so I don't, but anyway, for me, it's much more of a political, and it's a symptomatic reading of the Judeo-Christian codes that lead to nihilism, and then how do you reevaluate that in order to breed and discipline into the future. I think Foucault is a much more careful reader of the will to power in some ways than Heidegger in some way. But anyway, it's something to talk about. The will to power for Heidegger is art, sublimation.
Uh-huh. Man, I wish we had those on video.
What do you mean?
Or Nietzsche lectures.
The one I did? Those seminars?
Those are so good.
Those were good, yeah.
They're lost.
Yeah, I love Nietzsche. So I'm really good at that. I can't stand it.
Maybe we have them on. You have them on tape, right?
Do you have some of those on tape?
I have to go.
Some of the Nietzsche, yeah. That'd be good if we could
should dig them
transcribe. They
up.
were good. That was a good class.
We did like 1,000 weeks on Nietzsche.
Yeah.
It was super long.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. I'm not that old. Right. Talking about that eternal recurrence. I read eternal recurrence as the same, rhetorically, as a rhetorical device in the corpus of Nietzsche. That it basically is very similar to Marx's 18th Brumaire.
Mm-hmm.
The first time these things appear as tragedy, the second time as farce.
Yeah.
Nietzsche wanted to, and I also read Blanquet, who also has a theory of the eternal recurrence, the 19th century poet who was imprisoned.
First or second? Before or after Nietzsche?
He was during,
Same
maybe
time.
a little bit late, about the same time.
He went to
Blanquet, the great radical. He actually came up with the whole thing of the eternal recurrence of the same. Yeah. So this is interesting, yeah. And at the same time, what's being invented is the proletarian myth, the general strike. The myth of the general strike is what, is basically, the metaphysical principle, if you will. If you want to think of this in Hegelian terms, what's the underlying substance of movement politics? It's ultimately work stoppage, complete work stoppage, and taking control of the forces of production. Without the myth of the general strike, you don't have anything on the left, right? You don't have a narrative, right? Tell me if I'm wrong. Yeah, I mean, it's okay. I mean, isn't Sorel absolutely necessary for, that kind of consciousness? I mean, to a sense, the general strike. And you have that with Rosa Luxemburg as well. I mean, I'm not, I'm just talking about narrative here. I'm not talking about the real, or et cetera. I'm talking about, you need a narrative, you need a founding myth. For any kind of movement, I'm convinced, we had this discussion with Jose. Remember when Jose took the class for Peter once? We had a very good discussion about the need for myths on the left.
Yeah.
Because myths generate something, in a way. Yeah. Very important, very important. And the myth of the left is the myth of the general strike. I mean, it's Sorelian moment, right? In many ways. Of course we're exploited. Of course we have militants, et cetera, right? Yeah. But where would you be without the general strike? In a sense, or that weapon. You know what I mean? I mean, yeah. I don't know. I mean,
general strike or insurrection.
Yes, but I mean, general strike sometimes led to insurrection, as you know. I mean, look at the Russian, look at the history of 1917, in a way. Yeah. So, anyway, I think this is important to keep in mind, too. Nietzsche was very good at this, understanding the role of myth as well. To my mind, Nietzsche is, the thinker of our times, to my mind, because he is able to read everything symptomatically. He's not on a quest, right, to be the absolute system builder. He's distrustful of this, right? Unlike Heidegger, he's not interested in rewriting the history of being, ontology. I mean, even those are very ambitious and noble efforts, he's really interested as a radical symptomatologist and really is saying, metaphysician, heal thyself. Let's get away from metaphysics so we can really heal ourselves. So he's really trying to undo these illusions of metaphysics in a lot of ways. So if he's reading Hegel today, he's going to talk about this force as an illusion vis-a-vis the understanding, on the way to consciousness. Yeah.
So did we got to the real now, right? Basically, in thought, the notion, qua notion, right?
Well, not completely, because we have to get to reason.
Right.
And
Well, we did get
to
to the first expression of reason.
Yes, that's right.
The appearance of reason.
Yes, right.
144.
Yeah.
I guess that's the.
Yeah, I'm going to look up in the German if this is the same word as reason, and I have a German side by side with on my desk at home, so I'm trying with my very limited German to, yeah. This is about the middle term. 144 is very important too, about the middle term. And
we can wait if we want to have our.
Yeah. This will be good to keep in mind for when Arto does stuff. We can bring this into the conversation. It might be more pregnant and meaningful there. But I can go back to this, right? Right. I like his language. He's very down home. The being is therefore called appearance. For we call being that is directly in its own self a non-being, a surface show. So instead of saying it's a shit show or a clown show, he says it's a surface show. But it's not merely a surface show, it is an appearance, a totality of show. This totality is totality, or as a universal, is what constitutes the inner of things, the play of forces, a reflection of the inner to itself. So without force, we don't have a totality. That's something you can, it's very much maybe related to Nietzsche in terms of the will to power as well, which is a movement of a totality as well, right? In it, the things of perception are expressly present for consciousness, that they are in themselves as moments which immediately and without rest or stay turn into their opposite, the one immediately into the universal, the essential immediately into the unessential, and vice versa. This is a very interesting chapter. How does force play out? I'll take a look. I don't know I forgot how sophisticated it is. Derrida wrote a piece called Force and Signification. which takes on force here. I mean, Derrida comes very much, of course, out of French Hegelianism. And and so there's something there that might be elucidating about this chapter. It just dawned on me to go back and look at that.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Yeah. All right. So,
Okay.
yeah. So this is maybe what we should do. We should think about, for next week, I'm just saying this now, I'm not finished, but for next week, we want to definitely read up to The Truth of Self-Certainty from pages 104 all the way to 119, The Freedom of Self-Consciousness. Okay? We're going to read the Lordship and Bondage sections, right?
Okay, cool.
Okay? So that'll get us on another level of the politics. Look, I know this is difficult because he's going through, once again, how do we get to consciousness itself, right? What are these dialectical steps? But if you can think again of this like I tried to do it, a couple of weeks ago, think of this as a novel of self-certainty, perception, and then the movement to force and understanding. And then understanding becomes a new lever, right, on the way to self-consciousness. This is the story, if you will, of consciousness, that sense certainty is not enough. We're still in the realm of appearance. Perception, not enough. And force and understanding, also with this expression of appearance, is not enough. So again, we're trying to get to what Josh brought up, the real is the rational, and the rational is the real. The relationship between reason and the real here. And what is this real, right? In a sense. But remember here, again, he's in dialogue with people of his time.
Yeah.
So the science part, force and understanding, is with Newton, right? Faraday, and others, that are commenting on them, right? I don't see any Darwin here, Erasmus Darwin, and it's too early for, Charles Darwin. That's 52 years later after this book is The Origin of the Species. Although, as you know, Marx wanted to dedicate capital to Charles Darwin. Darwin said no. Not good for my reputation. It's like what I call people. It's not good for my reputation to be associated with you, Michael. Anyway, it's kind of interesting, huh? He went to Darwin, asked Darwin, to take it.
That wouldn't be.
Anyway, listen, try to think about this. I think it would help. I'm sure everybody here has read at least part of Capital, right, on the commodity form. Think about how Marx is undoing things dialectically in that section on the commodity, how he divides it into exchange and use value, how dialectical it really is, what he's doing, And another good example of this at work, bringing back up force and totality, is to look at the Introduction to Political Economy, 1857. The beginning introduction to the Grundrisse on, production, consumption, distribution, consumption, and exchange value, and how this is working together. And if you don't see it as together, you're missing it, right? If you only see production and consumption, you're missing the truth of the subject, if you will, or you're missing the essential, if you will. Yeah. So this is very, very important to try to think this way. It's very hard for us to, like I said, to get into this dialectically. But what I want to do too, we'll do this after the, next semester. I want to spend a lot of time on the ethical self-consciousness. And I'm going to give you sections of the ethics of psychoanalysis from 59, Lacan's great, to me, one of his most interesting seminars. How does one follow one's desire? And remember, again, the Kojèvian reading here is about Hegel and desire. It's not only about Hegel and knowing. So we're trying to do multiple levels. I'm sorry. Let me just check this out. call you back later, you can just put that in, send a message. I don't know, all these little finger tipping. Yeah. So, I mean, some other thoughts about this section? I know it's dense, and I know we haven't, again, covered everything here. 147, very important. I would read this very carefully because this is kind of the emergent, right? The inner world or supersensible beyond. And so we have this interchangeableness, inner world and force, right? Supersensible beyond has, however, come into being. It comes from the world of appearance, which has mediated it. In other words, appearance is its essence, and in fact, its filling. The supersensible is the sensuous and the perceived posited as it is in truth. But the truth of the sensuous and the perceived is to be appearance, only an appearance. We completely misunderstand this if we think, right? Is therefore appearance qua appearance. We completely misunderstand this if we think that the supersensible world is therefore the sensuous world, or the world as it exists for immediate sense certainty and perception. For the world of appearance, and this is very important, is on the contrary, not the world of sense knowledge and perception as a world that positively is, but this world posited as something superseded, something overcome, right? Or as, in truth, an inner world. Okay? It is often said that the supersensible world is not appearance, but what is here understood by appearance is not appearance, but rather the sensuous world as itself, right? Really, actually. Mm-hmm. Okay?
I guess that's
interiorization is going on here. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
When we achieved the really actual, basically in this chapter, like it's no longer in the sensible appearances, but in thought ultimately.
Well, yeah, we're trying to get to the actual. Yes. We're trying to get to the actual, and actual in German also means timeliness. Mm-hmm. Say something is Aktualität. It's the act of the actual in time. It's timeliness. German's an interesting language this way. It's very interesting in this sense. The Tat is the act, T-A-T. And the Aktualität is the actuality of that act, or the timeliness of the act. Mm-hmm. Okay? So it's interesting, that temporality that's going on. Again, we're really missing a lot by, I pulled out the German because Josh kind of got me going, about this section. I wanted to understand what he meant by force and understanding, and I had some questions about how he used Verstanden. Mm-hmm. So I pulled out the German in, a very limited way, kind of looked at it, and, but it's pretty amazing once you see how they compound on the terms, and, Yeah. And then the play of forces, right? You have to think of this. Think of the interplay in the play. Hegel's very playful too. It's not all serious and severe, or as Adorno said, a face ravaged by his time. Its continence was ravaged by its time. Yeah. So some other thoughts? I mean, you have the Heraclitean moment here, the flux.
Yeah.
Right, in force.
I was going to go there too.
You were going to go there? Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I just thought that was, it's kind of the same notion that we've covered over and over again. I think he makes this point, several times over in this chapter. Okay. Eventually you get one of them, I feel like. You get
one of them. It's repetitious in some ways, and I'm trying to play on that as well.
Yeah.
Well, let's turn to the end, and maybe we can conclude with this today and pick up next week, and I'm glad we're back on the track here. Okay? In 165, we see that in the inner world of appearance, and remember he's reflecting on the inner world, right? The inner Welt in German, of appearance, of the Scheinung, or Scheinung. The understanding in truth comes to know nothing else but appearance. It's all you can know in the interior. But not in the shape of a play of forces, but rather that play of forces in its absolutely universal moments and in their movement. In fact, the understanding experiences only itself. Raised above perception, consciousness exhibits itself closed in a unity with the supersensible world through the mediating term of appearance, through which it gazes into this background lying behind appearance. The two extremes of this syllogism, the one of the pure inner world, the other that of the inner being gazing into the pure inner world, have now coincided, and just as they, qua extremes, have vanished, so too the middle term as something other than these extremes has also vanished. This, as something other than these extremes, is already vanished. This curtain of appearance hanging before the inner world is therefore drawn away, and we have the inner being, the I, gazing into the inner world. And it's interesting he uses the I, as the inner being, the vision of the undifferentiated self-same being, which repels itself from itself, posits itself as an inner being containing different moments, but for which equally these moments are immediately not different. Self-consciousness. It is manifest that behind the so-called curtain, which is supposed to conceal the inner world, there is nothing to be seen unless we go behind it ourselves, as much in order that we may see, so that there may be something behind there which can be seen. You talk about Wizard of Oz, don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. You got it right here.
Well,
ideology. Think about this.
Was he a Mason?
An attempt of ideology, right?
Wasn't he a Freemason?
He gave lectures to the Freemasons.
So I think
he may have joined, I don't know, but
weird.
He gave lectures after hours to the Freemasons.
They do
it's very radical, Hegel.
They do some curtain ceremony.
Hegel. Oh. Yeah, after hours at the university, he would go to the Freemason and give lectures in philosophy.
Because you have to knock on the curtain, then a hand comes through the curtain.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, the so-called
the hand of the curtain.
The so-called, the hand behind the curtain. I'm not the great Oz.
There's a secret end.
Saying the curtain has fallen away.
Who said this?
Tulsi Gabbard.
Oh, she said that after Kamala Harris dropped out?
No, she said that about Hillary Clinton.
Oh, yeah. That curtain really
the curtain has fallen away.
Beautiful.
Exposed the Queen of the Warmongers.
Well, you know the great phrase in The Wizard of Oz. Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. It's a great thing. It's so good. Yeah. So anyway, to conceal there's nothing to be seen unless we go by. So as much in order that we may see, as there may be something behind there which can be seen. But at the same time, it is evident that we cannot know with more ado, go straight away behind appearance. For this knowledge of what is the truth of appearance is ordinarily conceived, its inner being is itself only the result of a complex movement. And this is important. This is a summation, right? Whereby the modes of consciousness, meaning, perceiving, and understanding vanish, right? Mm-hmm. And it will be equally evident that the cognition of what consciousness knows and knowing itself requires a still more complex movement, the exposition of which is contained in what follows. So now we're going to move on to the truth of self-certainty and self-consciousness. So we're finishing with part A, and maybe what I should do is I'll see what kind of time I have, I'm kind of backed up, but I would like to maybe just do a summation of A, consciousness, mm-hmm. right? B is self-consciousness. You know the structure of this book. I mean, it's really very much, the preface, the introduction, then there's section A, section B, and we're going to spend some time in B, and then I really want to spend some time definitely on the notion of reason, right? Especially in terms of the ethical order, right? Yeah? And then you have spirit. So as you know, you have self-consciousness, and then C is reason, right? And to me, Kojève, Sartre, and others stay in self-consciousness. Maybe even Lacan in a certain way, right? In terms of the master-slave and the subject so supposed to know, and the sujet, the analysand, and the analyst, and the four discourses with the master discourse being that of capitalism, the other side of psychoanalysis. But anyway, going to reason, right? You have Lukács, Marcuse, the entire Frankfurt School. They're coming out of the reason, right? And the inner and the outer is an organic shape instead of the inner and outer as force, right? So we're going to begin to see this at work too. So I mean, I want to read this book. Listen, I'll try to keep it going in terms of its historicity, right? Its formal arrangements, its concatenation of arguments, who he's taking on, and at the same time, you know, towards our own edification and understanding. So I hope we can do that. So anyway, we started on time tonight, so maybe we could, you know, close it here.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that
We went
good?
the
Is
full
that
time.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. And, and so, yeah, I'll see you next week, and I mean, I guess some of you at Stanley's on Saturday. It's gonna do, Marcus on the altar. Yeah, I'll be there, yeah. I'm under orders, man. The daughter told me.